Hey, Sister Straight Talk about boys.
About boys, I have to
Mhm.
feel, I feel like I have a little bit of imposter syndrome here because I'm not raising any boys. Just letting the secret out here. So, Krista, I'm going to defer to you in this conversation as being our resident expert in raising boys because one, you've thought about it a lot more than I have. Two, you've practiced it a lot more than I have.
Mhm.
So, I'm looking forward to getting your wisdom.
Well, I think the thing about boys is that boys are kind of in a hard place in culture right now. And I feel like we talked a lot about that with John Tyson. I
Mhm.
really appreciated his insight into that. But that's why I love talking about boys, one, for just because it's the waters I swim in.
Mhm.
But I also think boys are in a little bit of a hard spot in culture. And so I really appreciate this series and conversation because of that too.
Mhm. Yeah, and Heather talked about it too. Just
Mhm.
kind of numbing out and not being given strong role models to look to, or they have them, but the role models aren't being honored in a way that points boys to that. Like, no, these are good men. Because we are
Mhm.
surrounded, I liked her point. We are surrounded by good men. I mean,
Mhm.
I am
Yeah.
really good men in my life. I've had some doozies, some not so good, but just kind of like seeking out goodness, right? You find what you're looking for. So if you look for good men, they are there.
Mhm.
And we need to point our boys to them. Okay, so why does this topic matter to you?
Well, it really matters so deeply to me because I I'm just so passionate about pouring into my sons personally that
Mm-hmm.
I really feel like I feel the same way about my daughter, but since we're talking about sons, I'm just going to
Mm-hmm.
speak specifically to that today. But that it is such an important role for me to really embolden them to become the young men that they are meant to be and to really help in that process and not hurt in that process. And unfortunately, because I am imperfect and human, I have done some things that have hurt in that process because we all have,
Mm-hmm.
because we do make mistakes as parents. But I think the important thing is that we keep equipping ourselves, we keep learning, we keep growing, and we keep trying to be kind of that. God is ultimately their firm foundation, but we're that next layer of foundation for them to stand on. I've always said my prayer is that my kids would stand on my shoulders, that that they would go further and higher than me, in who they are and kind of their impact in the world, and that I would just lay a foundation for them to stand on. And so as I'm looking at this idea of parenting boys, that's my hope and my prayer, is that I can help be that for them so that they can truly lean into all that God has for them as
Mm-hmm.
people, and they can become that. And then beyond that, I just really care about, like I was just saying, I really care about young men and just some of the challenges that I think in particular Gen Z is facing as boys.
Mm-hmm.
How about
Yeah.
you?
Well, I mean, I'm not raising boys, but I have lots of boys that I love very much. And I also know that there are people out there who are raising boys right now that are going to be men that I love very much someday in our family's future. And so I want boys to thrive, but just I want boys to thrive because then the world thrives,
That's
right?
right. Mm-hmm.
That if boys are doing well and women are doing well together, boys and girls, I shouldn't have one be an adult and one be a child, but if men and women are doing well together and we're raising future men and women, the world is going to be better. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, we're raising world changers. We are being world changers by raising world changers. And so I care about that. And I care about my friends who are struggling right now, trying to figure out the practicalities of, okay, how does this work? So how do we
Mhm.
do this? And I think this series helped with that.
I do too. I really feel like this series has been an equipping series. And okay, here's where they're at. And here are some things we can do to relate to them better, to meet them where they're at better, and to come alongside of them. So I really agree.
Mhm.
So, one thing we haven't discussed much is fatherlessness. And I mean, that was hit on just a little bit, but maybe speak a little bit to some of the things that you've read about how the absence of a father impacts sons. And maybe for any listeners that are in that spot, or if you know someone through church or whatever who is
Mhm.
a boy who's being raised by a single mom, just what's the impact and kind of how can we help with that?
Mhm. Well, the statistics are kind of discouraging. Like if a father's not in the home, then both boys and girls are more likely to be in jail, to not graduate from high school. That's kind of on the macro level, right? Again, societal impact. And the good news is, and I think John Tyson referenced this, that studies show that if a few men or even one significant man has a relationship with a young man, it can reverse a lot of those higher tendencies. Now, this doesn't mean, I am not saying at all that if a young man is growing up without a father that he's going to jail. Do not hear me say that. That's just kind of on the macro level. But I think what it shows is that dads provide stability, often financial stability. They provide stability for mom. I mean, when there are two parents in the home, it provides a safety net so that if one person is ill or one person loses a job or one person needs to take care of kids, whatever it is, there's just two are stronger than one. So that absence makes a difference, just like mom's being absent makes a difference. But I want to encourage moms that if you are raising a child alone, whether boy or girl, know that you are not alone because, and I should have pulled the statistic for this, but I believe that the majority of kids in the United States at some point in their childhood will not live with both parents. They will have at least a phase of time where they're living with just one parent, which means that this is a common experience. So there are other moms out there. You're not alone. There are other moms out there who are doing it. Might be hard, but they're doing it well. And I think the biggest thing is exposing our boys to the kind of men that we want them to esteem to be. So I think Dr. Anthony Bradley, if you're interested, whether, I just find him interesting as a kind of a cultural voice in the world. He's a professor at the King's College. He's a writer and he writes for a number of publications. He's a theologian. He lives in New York, and he talks a lot about the impact of fathers on boys, but he also talks about just the general sense of what it means to grow into being a man. And so I think he has a lot of good resources on his website that he talks about male friendships and the importance that boys have on each other. And right now it's really interesting. He's doing this whole thing about fraternities, college fraternities, and the positive impact they can have, that we have this negative stereotype that the media kind of perpetuates. And so he's going around to college campuses, to a lot of fraternities that have invited him to come speak, to talk about what it means to be men of honor. So he uses the hashtag heroic masculinity instead of toxic masculinity. Like, what does
I
it
love
mean
it.
to be a man? And he told the cutest story one time that he was Zooming with a class of kids, and he was telling them that in order to grow into be kind of the hero man, that you needed to take risks and you needed to protect. And he said this little boy hit his leg and said, "I knew it." And like he was hearing a narrative that was different than what he is being offered by the world. And that's what Dr. Bradley is really saying, is the narrative we're giving boys is not casting a vision of what it means to be a hero in the world, and that we can do that. And it doesn't have to be at the peril of women. And then
Oh
there,
my gosh, that's the cutest story.
I
I
know.
knew it.
I knew it. And I could just picture this little boy being like, "I knew it. I meant to be a hero." There is a book that's just, I don't even know if it's on shelves yet. It's coming out this spring called Raising Sons of Promise, a guide for single mothers of boys by Roland C. Warren. And it is a faith-based book. So if you're looking for a faith-centered book that's kind of current, it probably talks about a lot of today's issues. I haven't looked at it. It looks like a good one.
Yeah, that's great. Those are helpful. I like those resources. What would you say were some of your biggest takeaways from the series as a whole?
Well, none of these are surprising. First, intentionality is key. I am reminded again and again that I parent often out of reacting to my circumstances instead of proactively thinking, what do I want the end result to be? And then building toward those. So just the intentionality of the parents we talk to and how important that is. Two, this is where I got kind of stuck, and I think a lot of parents are stuck, is the balance right now between helping our kids develop resilience, so allowing them to experience hard things, while caring for their mental health when we're being told that kids are in a mental health crisis with anxiety and depression.
Totally.
I don't know what the easy answer is there, but kids need both. And it probably is this tender approach of giving them boundaries in which to feel some discomfort so that some resilience can be built, and yet being mindful of, especially with older kids, things that might be warning signs for a mental health situation. So that whole, just the tension I think that parents are feeling right now was highlighted to me. And I don't know that there's an easy answer, but that was
No, I do
something
find
that
that
stood out to me.
question though, that, and I know I've said this before, but it bears repeating as much as possible, that David Thomas said. And when he asked, ask yourself the question, is this just uncomfortable? Is this just kind of hard for your child? Or is this dangerous? And so that to me is like a tool that I've used to be able to discern. I'm not saying, I mean, I think the tension is so hard and so real, and we could get that question wrong. But in general, I think it's at least a tool we can access.
Yeah, because I'm all for making our kids experience discomfort. And yet I'm also asking myself a lot these days, am I asking my children to hold more than they are designed to handle at this age, given the stressors that they're going through? So yeah, I think whereas Derek's always like, we need to make their life uncomfortable. I'm like, okay, yes. And, just that tension. Okay. And then the third thing is, I've already said it, boys need models of what it means to be a healthy man. So if dad's around and he's healthy, that's a good starting place. And if he's not either around or healthy, then finding some other men for your boy to be near, and really to honor those men in a young man's life, and just pointing out the qualities that I think that you appreciate in maybe a school principal or a teacher or a coach. I really appreciate how complimentary he is, how the tone of voice he uses when he corrects people. I mean, just the more specific we can get about the kind of characteristics we want to be noticing together, I think that helps our kids. Because sometimes in my mind, it's really clear why I like someone. But at a 14-year-old's mind, it may not be as clear why we think this guy is a great guy. So maybe to be specific in pointing out those traits.
Yeah, I like that. It's really good.
Okay, tell me what 3 things you took away from this
It's hard to
series.
pick 3 because there were so many, but I really liked the conversation that I had with Tanita about listen to what they're actually saying and the questions they're actually asking. So instead of just, she talked about how we have to listen differently, that maybe even they post a meme and that's how they're communicating. That this generation, because they're digital natives, their first language is digital. And so often they're speaking in digital formats. They're trying to tell us things. And so we have to listen with a new ear. And I found that to be really insightful. Also, I think a lot of times as parents, we answer questions they're not even asking. And so really listening to what questions are they asking, and instead of telling them things, actually repeat back to them what we hear them saying. So I thought that was really helpful. I also really liked the question that she said at the end of that interview. And she said, ask them on a scale of 1 to 10, how's your mental health today? You know, she said at one point with past generations, the question was, how's your heart? This generation actually asking them, how's your mental health? That speaks to them differently because they speak the language of mental health. And so, and they speak the language of anxiety and depression. They know this language. And so if you use that with them, they can easily answer that. So I really appreciated that. Again, practical tool. And then can we just say I'm calling him JT, John Tyson. The JT interview had just some, I thought, gold nuggets. And one of them was, we don't sow and reap in the same season. And I just found that to be like an incredibly powerful statement for developing endurance in parenting in the teen years. Because I think so many parents feel such discouragement and tension when they're parenting adolescents. And so I really loved that of just, we don't sow and reap in the same season. So keep sowing and trust that eventually that kind of love and commitment. I mean, he also said consistency over intensity. So, you know, kind of doing those acts of love, whether that's listening, whether that's serving, whether that's, you know, just cooking dinner night after night. I mean, and also being there and, you know, going through the ups and downs and navigating the anxiety and navigating the depression, but just like kind of sowing consistently over time, that will reap a harvest later. And so just stay the course, you know. So I really appreciate it. I thought that was a really powerful encouragement. And then I also really appreciated what he said about with older kids, keep asking about the 3 big questions of life. So who are you becoming? The freedom that you have. What are you thinking about your future? And how are you viewing sex and dating? There you go.
And then listen to their answers, whether you like them or not.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And then of course he says, I mean, at the end, he said 3 other things, like keep conversations running around. What are you learning about God? What are you learning about yourself? And what are you learning about life? So I feel like, man, if we just even circled, you know, those questions that he asked with our kids, it's a lot to talk about there, but it's just getting them to talk and making sure that we're listening so that they will talk.
Yeah. And I want to encourage the moms of girls. If you haven't listened to that interview, I've had other moms of only girls message me and say how much they've liked it and appreciated it. I mean, obviously all that Krista just said applies to girls too. I think he did a really good job of speaking about some specific needs around boys.
Mhm.
But then also a lot of what he talked about were parenting principles and helping our kids launch well into the world. And I think we all need that help. So his interview has proven to be very popular, and we are not surprised. One,
because he's just wise.
Yeah.
He speaks wisdom. He just speaks wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, what do you think it looks like? This is a question I wanted to ask. What does it look like to honor a son or to honor a boy in your sphere? So maybe even it's a boyfriend of your daughter, or maybe it's someone at church, or it's someone at school that you are getting to know well because maybe your daughter's friends with him. Whatever way you're interfacing with boys, what are some ways to honor boys?
Well, I think with all young people, as they're growing into themselves, to honor them means offering respect of their opinions, especially when they're different than ours, because they're going to know that they're different than ours usually. So then they say something and then they wait for you to respond to either confirm or deny their preconceived ideas of how you're going to respond. And this is an area of growth for me, just in general, because I hit panic mode and I want to make sure that they hear why I believe what I believe, and instead just letting it sit and listening more than talking. Again, nothing new here, but I think that offers a respect of, I respect that you've thought this through, that I don't need to belittle you or be condescending, that I can honor that you're a growing into adult person. And then how we talk about them in front of them. I remember reading an article about leaving your kids at school, like 10 things to do on the day where you drop your child off at the dorm. And one of the points was only say positive things about your child in front of them when talking to other people, because you'll be meeting other parents and other students. And I just thought that's just good for young adults. They don't want to hear you saying things that are diminishing them. And then how you talk about them privately too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a discipline. I mean, I think in general, in fact, I've known some people who've done that for Lent. Like they're just giving a negative perspective about the people in their life, and they're going to speak positive over them, to them, the whole thing, which is great.
What does it look like for you?
I think honoring the separation that occurs as they get older and they start to become more independent and they're kind of reaching for that manhood. I think as a mom, that can be a hard thing because we're wanting that same level of intimacy that maybe we have experienced earlier in their lives. And and this is with daughters too, I mean, it really is. But as they are stretching, they actually need to separate from their mothers. Like they need to, it's important for them and fathers. But I think especially moms can struggle with this and feel like, oh my gosh, you're leaving me behind, or actually make them feel guilty for doing that. Or they may even become a little bit more confrontational because they're testing their leadership a little bit and their leadership skills. And so just not taking that personally, whether it's the pushing back or the separation, not taking that personally, just staying very consistent, staying very loving. And still, I mean, obviously we need to keep our boundaries. If they're, doing it disrespectfully, there's boundaries around that. Like, I'm not saying not to have those. What I'm saying is that this is a natural part of them becoming young men. And we have to honor that process. And that's not always easy for us. But ultimately, we want them to be strong young men. So we really need to honor that stretch toward independence. So that would be one. I think too, it's a little bit of what you hit on, but a little bit of a different twist on it. And that is honor that their needs are different than maybe what we or their dad needed at that age. So not expecting them to be the same person or have the same needs. For example, let's say that we've talked about this before in episodes, but let's say that son doesn't want to play basketball or
Mm.
doesn't want to go out to that dance or doesn't want to fill in the blank. Just because that was important to us or to their dad in that season of life, it does not mean that it needs to be important to them. So honoring their individuality in that and recognizing that, again, they're separate. They're not us, they're separate.
Mhm.
And then I would say the third thing is honoring their strengths and really, really communicating to them how capable that we think that they are. So
Mhm.
whether that's in their strength zone or even just about kind of daily activities and daily life, that you are capable, well done on taking care of this, like really catching them being good,
Mhm.
so to speak. I know that's, a saying that even we used to use when they were little, but kind of catching them doing these positive life skill type things and really honoring them in that. And then also playing off their strengths and building those up as much as possible. I mean, I was even at a conference last week where we talked about leadership. And so I was doing all this leadership training. And in most workplaces, they were talking about how in most workplaces, people, the bosses tend to go in and say, okay, good job on this, but here's where
Mhm.
you need to grow. And they kind of have this long list of like growth areas for their employee. They're like, actually, the reverse is the best approach. You actually want to give a very small area they need to grow and instead go hard on their strengths because that actually leads to more growth. And the studies have all shown this, right? Well, the
Hmm.
same is true with our sons, that go hard on the strengths because that's really where we can make some really good ground with them.
Mhm. Yeah. Ooh, I'm thinking about a lot of things. It's all good. The strength zone.
Mhm.
Okay, let's talk friendships for a second.
Mm,
How do we help sons navigate friendships? And then
mhm,
maybe the influences, good or bad, within those friendships.
mhm. Well, I mean, the good influences to me is easy because, man, you just make them a part of your family. Like any good influences that they have in friendships, in young life leaders, and whoever. I mean, just bring them in. The answer is always yes. Can they come with us? Yes. Can they come over? Yes. Can they come for dinner? Yes. Like the answer is always yes. And so that's, I feel like, an easy way of how I can aid in that, in those good influences. And because I mean, in especially in the teenage years, in young adult years, they are reaching beyond the family. So any
Mhm.
positive influences that we can encourage, yes, yes, yes. And then the other thing, I always look for opportunities to really care for their friends because that shows them love that I'm caring for their friends well. So remembering their birthdays, making sure I have a certain kind of like one of my son's friends, they all loved Fresca. So I always had Fresca in the mini fridge because they always wanted that. So that's just a way of showing them love. And then I would say, if it's challenging, if the influences are challenging, that's much harder. And I think that's where, because we don't have as much control, but as much as possible, try and expose them to environments that have positive surroundings. One of the things that I really love Atomic Habits, and James Clear talks a lot about environment. And he actually has a quote that I thought I would read. He said, environment is the invisible hand that shapes human behavior. We tend to believe that our habits are a product of our motivation, talent, and effort. Certainly, these qualities matter. But the surprising thing is, especially over a long period of time, your personal characteristics tend to get overpowered by your environment. So if you want to maximize your odds of success, then you need to operate in an environment that accelerates your results rather than hinders them. And so, just this whole idea that we actually often attribute kind of good, bad habits of our kids to their personal failings or personal wins, when environment is kind of much bigger than we know or give credit
Mhm.
to, that's shaping them. And so this whole idea of like, find as much as possible, how can we find a good environment for our kids,
Mhm.
especially if they're struggling with bad influences. Do you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on that question?
Well, I just remember that Heather said that she helps her boys learn how to identify and name their feelings. I think anytime you can communicate what's going on inside, I mean, so many of us as adults struggle with that, with being able to identify what we're feeling and communicate it. The more we can coach boys in that, especially because they're not encouraged at the same way that girls are to develop that skill. And that verbal skill, I think, is going to be to their advantage, and it's going to be to their future spouse's advantage, not to mention everybody else that's going to be in their orbit. And um, even though honesty can be hard, I think as our kids grow, giving them places where they can be honest about what's happening around them and then not being shocked when they tell us. I remember my sister-in-law, Lindsay, took a parenting class and they had to practice. She and her husband had to practice telling each other shocking things so they could take turns practicing not being shocked, so that when their kids told them shocking things, they wouldn't be shocked. And to
That's
say,
so funny.
but I've just been talking recently about that as a parent, that when I tell my kids, yeah, that's not surprising because this is the way the world is, the hard things, then they trust me more to be grounded in reality. And especially because I'm a person who does tend to kind of insert my opinion and the why behind my opinion. But part of it is because I see how the world operates. And so I'm not surprised when hard things come up in their environment or in their friends' lives, because I know this is the hard reality of the world. And you maybe haven't experienced that outside of our home before, but now as you're being exposed to that, it's not surprising. And it's part of why we believe that God's grace and redemption is what we need, because the world's operating out of desperation for it, whether the world recognizes that or not.
Mhm.
Okay, Krista, final words from you, our mom of boys expert. 3 practical ways that we can connect with boys and sons.
Yeah, I can only go on really what my experience is. And I've read some things, but for me, it's just activities that put us side by side. So boys talk when you are actually doing something. They much prefer that over face to face. They don't like that direct eye to eye, like girls sitting down with a cup of coffee and they're looking
Mhm.
straight in each other's eyes. It's like, have you ever heard that dogs think it's confrontational when you look them in the eyes?
Mm-mm.
Yeah. So like if you ever meet an aggressive dog on the street, you never want to look that dog directly in the eye. You want to kind of look peripheral to see what the dog's doing because you don't want to be confrontational. Well, in some ways, there's a little bit of an analogy here in that boys, like they get kind of a little bit, not all boys, again, these are
Mhm.
generalizations, but a lot of boys get uncomfortable with that like intense eye to eye contact. So if they're side by side with you, whether you are paddleboarding or you are on a walk, or like I always try and get the boys to come with me when walking the dog. Like it's just a really simple thing. I'm like, hey, he
Mhm.
needs to be walked. Let's go together. Or even if you're driving, that counts
Mhm.
too. So a little trick that you have them drive when they're old enough to drive. You have them drive. They're practicing driving, and they can't do anything else but talk to you. So it's like, and you're side by side.
Mhm.
So, whenever they're doing something. And then for me, it's just been great to do activities that they love to do. So, whatever they love, to try and jump into that and love it with them. I love this quote with my friend whose wife loved Disneyland, and he really did not like Disneyland. But he said, Grace loves Disneyland. I love Grace. Therefore, I love Disneyland. And I just always love that because it's the same thing, you know?
Mhm.
Okay, so my son loves fill in the blank. Like maybe it's a band and I love him. Therefore, I love this band because I
Mhm.
love him, you know? So we're just really taking that attitude of I'm going to show interest and care about what they care about.
Yeah.
And then I think one-on-one time, you can never go wrong. So do something with them that's one-on-one and see where that goes. And sometimes that's really easy because they're going to a sports game and you have to drive them or whatever, right? Sometimes that's easy, but that doesn't always feel as meaningful as when you actually say, hey, I want to take a half a day with you. Let's go do this fun thing together. And then, just see what happens.
Mhm. Yeah. I was thinking as you were talking about the do what they love of Monica Swanson. I mean, hello, she's totally into surfing and golfing now because her
Yeah.
her boys. She's like,
Right.
I don't really surf, but I go to a lot of surfing competitions. I don't really golf, but I go to the golf course.
Yes.
Because that's what they love. And I often admire that of boy moms, just because the activities are a little bit more out of my comfort zone.
Mhm.
Than some of the activities that my girls choose to do. And yeah,
Well,
I
and I have to say, like, I still don't really get all the rules of football,
mhm,
like, but I can cheer with the best of them.
mhm,
So, and I'll take the good pictures. And like that totally like met my son's needs when he was playing. Like I had the good pictures and I had
mhm,
the great cheering and whatever. So they don't need us to know all the ins and outs of every football play, and my husband
mhm,
does. And so they had great conversations about that. But you're there, you're showing up, you care
mhm,
about it, you're trying to learn, you at least know his position and what his
mhm.
position is in charge of. So you don't have to be all things, but a little effort goes a long way.
Yeah, that's true. Isn't
Mhm.
that true? Okay.
Mhm.
Well, moms of boys, we salute you. We lift our glass to toast you.
We
We pray
salute
for
you.
you. All the
Yes.
things to you. And
Yes.
we're so grateful that we
Mhm.
can have this conversation with you to talk about what it means to raise the next generation of men, because Lord knows we need good men in our world. So
Mhm.
thank you for doing your job, for taking it seriously, for listening to a podcast about it so that you can either be a better mom or just feel less alone in the journey. And we hope that you got both practical help in this series and some encouragement to your heart, because you are doing the best job of being a world changer for good right where you are.
Okay, so I have a charge for all the moms out there. So when your son gets home today, if you have one, or when you see a son you're close to, a boy you're close to say, I know that this is hard right now, whatever it is, fill in the blank, whether it's a sport, it's a class, it's a friendship, it's a whatever, and say, I see you showing a lot of courage and strength in this way.
Mhm.
That's the charge.
Okay, it's
Okay,
good.
here we go. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.